All right. So the next section we're going to talk about is so in the last section we talked about this rise of capitalism. This system that was based on creating a lot of wealth for exploitation of labor and land. So now in the next section we're going to talk about how that was essentially that capitalistic system was exported to to essentially every part of the world at one point through colonialism and imperialism. So the exportation of capitalism. So, when Europe, began to kind of hit its national limits, when they started, when there was only so much you can kind of exploit in one country, and you had this, booming industrial revolution that was happening that needed to be fed. That's when they started looking, outside its boundaries, through colonialism, which, for like many countries like Spanish and Portugal, had been colonialism has been happening for a while at this point, as far as back as like, the 1500s. But it soon, kind of adapted and kind of expanded to other European countries as well, and became more of these, resource extraction kind of, capitalistic systems that was his main purpose is to make enormous amount of wealth and to bring resources back to industrial revolution that was occurring in Europe. So, colonialism. So just defining colonialism. So it's the process of acquiring partial or full control over another country for the purpose of economic exploitation, involving, variety of different things, from, ethnic cleansing indigenous people from their land. So taking over the indigenous land, and through genocide, through brutality, and then also, it involved, enslavement and exploitation of native populations to extract resources to be exported to home country. It involved spreading, white supremacy, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, patriarchy, all these systems to kind of justify the brutality that it was spreading. Involves the destruction and erasure of the Indigenous population, culture, history, and humanity. And the creation of unequal social relations and structures that often persist after colonialism. So a lot of these things, particularly like with like the anti-Indigenous racism, white supremacy, the anti-Black racism, patriarchy, all these things, and more, you are still, even though, we've passed, many of our countries, these countries have passed these colonial stages, have gained independence, and a lot of these systems, these colonial systems, are still with us today, and this is a big part of where a lot of racism and a lot of patriarchy and a lot of problems with our country, or with countries around the world, are experiencing is these leftover colonial systems. That were essentially created to exploit the land and labor of the world, and to and extract enormous wealth and resources to be shipped back to Europe. So in capitalism, wealth is created by exploiting land and labor, but in colonialism, entire countries become that land and labor that's being exploited. So that's another way to think about it. And Europe exported these capitalistic systems. They are often in these forms of these like plantation economies, or these resource extraction systems. Like the Spanish use these what they're called encomiendas, which were basically the extension of like feudal systems, where conquistadors would be granted a large amount of land, and all the people who lived in there were suddenly became enslaved to that conquistador. They had to work in plantation economies, and plantation systems, and mines, with the whole purpose of extracting as much resources to be exported back to their home countries. So we saw that with the Spanish encomiendas systems. We saw this with Britain. With British, many of their first colonies were started as these venture companies, like Virginia companies, Plymouth, in East India, was you know, these British companies that were chartered by the crown, but were really heavily invested in merchants, investors, and you know, with the hope, you know, with the purpose of going to these other countries and basically stealing land and then extracting the resources through, you know, as much as possible through you know, exploited labor, you know, most of the time enslaved labor. So, and then, you know, imperialism. So a lot of times imperialism is you know, it's very similar to colonialism. You know, there's a lot of different definitions kind of defining the two, but, and sometimes you can use them, you know, sometimes interchangeably, but there are some distinctions. But I think about imperialism, it's basically, you know, the final result of colonialism. Colonialism is going over, and it's like the action of actually colonizing, you know, countries and colonizing, you know, indigenous people and you know, enslaving and exploiting. Imperialism is kind of like the end result of that is where you create, you're basically creating an empire. So that's what a lot of these colonial governments were ultimately trying to do, is they're trying to create these empires. And once they have these empires, once they have these colonies, you know, it became, you know, I like this quote from Red Nation, it became the highest stage of capitalism in which production is concentrated into the international monopolies. So you created these, you know, what Europe was doing, you know, by, you know, creating these, this poor labor pool of, you're creating a lot of poverty and then forcing them to work in these horrific conditions in factories. You know, they're essentially doing that on a larger scale, but in an international scale, through imperialism, through creating these empires where, you know, the people in the colonies were working horrific conditions, you know, for the benefit of the, you know, the home countries, the empire. So I like this quote by Walter Rodney. He says, after the scope for expansion became limited inside of their national economies, their main attention was turned to those countries whose economies were less developed and who would therefore offer little or no opposition to the penetration of foreign capitalism. That penetration of foreign capitalism on a worldwide scale from the late 19th century onwards is what we call imperialism. Imperialism meant capitalistic expansion. It meant that European and North American and Japanese capitalists were forced by the internal logic of their competitive system to seek abroad in less developed countries opportunities to control raw material supplies, to find markets, and to find profitable fields of investments. So there was three, you know, a lot of historians will argue that there was three major waves of colonialism colonialism, you know, this is something that's been with us for a lot, you know, for a long, long time. Anytime a nation, you know, tried to create an empire, Roman Empire, and they tried to conquer a bunch of lands, you know, they did the same things as you know, these European countries are doing. They you know, destroyed cultures. They tried to assimilate people into their own culture. They tried to, you know, enslave people and use exploited labor. So, I mean, this isn't a new concept, but when we talk about European colonialism, there's typically three major waves of European colonialism, or Western colonialism. And the first one is what we call Age of Discovery, or people call it Old Imperialism. So this happened, you know, between the mid 1400s, you know, with you know, Columbus, you know, discovering you know, the Americas, and then, you know, kind of opening it up for Spanish and Portugal invasion in the 1500s to really the 1800s, you know. And that's, you know, so we had multiple, you know, mainly Western European countries, from, you know, Portugal, the Spanish, to the Dutch Empire, to, you know, British and France. So they kind of expanded in multiple directions, you know, from, you know, colonizing the Americas to India, Southwest Asia, China, so kind of all over. And they call it the Age of Discovery because they use this Catholic doctrine. They use multiple Catholic doctrines to kind of, you know, as a legal precedent to kind of justify what they're doing legally. But this was a big one where this doctrine basically allowed Europeans to discover, something. And once they discovered this new land, as long as it was, a non-white, non-Christian, nation, they could conquer it, enslave it, exploit it, do anything they want, as long as they were, spreading Christianity or spreading the Christian nation, their reach. So that's really important. I don't know if a lot of people really believe they actually discovered it, this land. Obviously there were people beforehand, but this was a legal document that, the president, implied, as long as they were discovering something that hadn't been discovered by other European countries, other Christian, European countries, and they could just dominate and enslave it and do whatever they want. And still the legal precedent today that, it's one of the main reasons why we don't give all the land back to Native Americans, as we still, our Supreme Court still uses this as a reason why, we have ownership over this land. But during this age of discovery wave, millions of indigenous people, died throughout the world, and particularly in America. I mean, they call it the American genocide. There's been a lot of documentation on this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later in the class. But tens of millions of people, indigenous people, died mainly from European diseases because they had no immunity to these diseases that Europeans were building up immunity over centuries. But a lot of brutality and slavery and things like that as well. And then the second wave is the scramble for Africa. So Africa, had this more influential colonization, European colonization, during the Age of Discovery, where Europeans, created this transatlantic slave market and really pushed Africa to sell millions of Africans into this market, as well as a lot of unequal exchanges and things like that. So there was some, colonization, mainly influential, but it wasn't until really the scramble of Africa that Africa became a colonized territory. And that's where, in the early, late 1800s, basically a bunch of, well, there's a couple of things. Europe had outlawed slavery, and at the same time they discovered a whole bunch of enormous wealth. And through exploring, Africa, particularly because of that medicine, quinine, that allowed, with the discovery of that in early 1800s, they expanded their ability to actually go in the interior of Africa, and they found an enormous amount of wealth. But at the same time, they all the European nations had outlawed slavery. So they looked to Africa as this place to where they needed, they all met together, basically at the Berlin Conference in 1885, and basically just carved up Africa, and figured out all these clever ways to continue slavery, just not, as the, official slave terms. They found other ways to enslave millions of Africans and exploit them, and it was a brutal, for between the end of the 1800s, to about mid 1900s, European powers, they conquered, through military force, they conquered, a majority of Africa and just ruled it, very brutally. We'll have a whole section today on kind of talking about what that looked like, but the biggest, the most, by far the most brutal regime was, Belgium's King Leopold, who's called the Butcher of Congo. He was granted, during this Berlin Conference, he was given Congo, this huge, piece of land in the middle of Africa, and he just, through just, this enslavement and torture, he forced through these plantation economies to extract enormous amount of resources, a lot of rubber and things like that. And ultimately, it's estimated around 10 million, Congolese people died through his, through a short period, through I want to say maybe 2 decades. It's an extremely brutal regime, but that's just one example of all these of these different very brutal colonizations that were happening all over Africa. Not just the brutalization, but also causing the big reason why Africa is underdeveloped. It stalled a lot of developments. It caused lots of famines. It caused lots of way they divided Africa. They divided cultural groups and ethnic tensions, and gave power to one ethnic group to pit them up against another one, and caused all kinds of ethnic conflicts. Even after many of these African countries gained independence. And then the last colonial movement, as we call it, new imperialism. So this was happened in late 1800s to now. It's still happening right now. But this is essentially a bunch of countries tried to create modern empires over the last century, and that included Japan, Russia, but also your usual most of your usual actors in Western Europe, and then the United States. So we start seeing the U.S. Become a colonial power and try to become an empire at this point. And they, from the U.S. policies of expanding and capturing, indigenous land out west, Mexican War, involving themselves in multiple wars, to mainly conquer over territory, whether it's west or the western United States, Western expansion, or the conquest of Hawaii, Spanish American War, Mexican American War. These are all wars that we either intentionally started or also just jumped in at the last second, like the Spanish American War. A lot of countries like Cuba were trying to get independence, and we jumped in and took over that. So we have a long history of colonies, from the Philippines to Cuba to the Panama Canal Zone. And some of these, they have gained independence over time, but they still struggle with a lot of colonialism, that, a lot of, effects of colonialism, and are, we're still heavily influenced into these countries. And then we still have a lot of, we're not alone, a lot of countries still have a lot of colonies. We don't talk about this that much, but like Puerto Rico, even though we call these things more territories, and but they're colonies, Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, American Samosa, we have a bunch of colonies left. France does, British. So we still have an empire right now. We've never really, dismantled this empire. So these are the three phases, and throughout these three phases, we essentially, every country in the world besides 4 or 5, if you count Ethiopia, there's debates on whether Ethiopia was colonized or whether it was just conquered briefly by Italy during World War II. But, let's say 5 countries in the entire world, escaped colonialism. And that's direct colonialism. They definitely did not escape indirect. They definitely, were, dealt with a lot of unequal exchanges, a lot of, a lot of neocolonialism, a lot of influence, a lot of, these countries did not escape, colonialism by far. And then some of them, like Japan, became a colonizer and colonized Thailand and Korea, two, countries that avoided colonialism as well. And Liberia was a product of American colonialism, where we set up as colony to there was a whole movement in the U.S. that, after, Civil War, to ship, Africans back to Africa. Or African Americans back to Africa, and that became a colony in itself. Even though we had never officially colonized it, or it was part of it, we still have. And they supposedly have independence. We still exert a lot of control, economic control over that area. So I really like this quote: "Imagine living in a world where nearly every inch of the earth has been colonized by European nations through conquest, inspired by belief in white culture and genetic superiority, and then saying white nationalism is a small group of people." Just imagine this take.
So this brings the question to just how was Europe able to conquer so much of the world? And that there's a lot of theories. I'm going to talk about a couple theories. There's a lot more out there. A lot of them are just theories, because there's no definite this is what led them to. But there's some, but a lot of things that we're going to talk about in the next 2 slides, are 3 slides. are things that definitely helped Europe conquer much of the world. A big one is, if you ever read the book Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. He talks about how Europe was able to become so powerful and conquer so much because of basically geography, where they where they ended up in the world. And he really focused on um, kind of trade routes between east and west, and he really focused on the Silk Road. Was this massive trade route, extending from Europe all the way to China, and because it was important because it extended east to west. It went on the same latitude, which basically meant it went on the same climate. So that's really important, because as opposed to trade routes going north to south that had different climates, when you have all these different countries trading on the same on the same climates, they're experiencing the same conditions, like the same agricultural conditions and things like that. So they're sharing technologies and advancements around similar situations, similar agricultural experiences. So they're actually working and helping each other kind of expand and grow quicker, as opposed to if it was north to south. A lot of things that they were experiencing wouldn't apply, and it wouldn't line up so much. So because of this Silk Road, Jared Diamond talked about, his theory was that that really advanced a lot of the countries along this, but particularly Europe. For example, guns was invented in China. But it really, it traveled along the Silk Roads, and Europe was able to take that invention and really add to it, and make, the modern, colonial, muskets and things like that. And that was, essential to some of its early colonization, was having these guns and having these advanced technologies, in multiple different ways. Particularly one was, when Europe started trading and started the transatlantic slave trade, the main thing that they used to get African nations to kind of trade a lot of slaves was enslaved people was these guns. And this is really important, because not every African nation was on board with the slave trade. But what they essentially did by trading guns, that at first they weren't so advanced, but they became a lot more advanced, a lot more powerful than African weapons, and eventually African nations, they needed these weapons, because they saw that if Europe was trading with their neighbors and they were at war with their neighbors, they couldn't, they became vulnerable. So it created this arms race, where even if African countries didn't want to participate in the slave trade, they had to, just so they can keep up with the arms race and not be conquered by their neighbors. So that really, and because of that, because of that slavery, the slave system, that Africa lost millions of able-bodied people that would have helped the development of Africa. But because of that, they were much more vulnerable and when Europe did come and actually colonize Africa in the late 1800s. um, and so that was one, because it helps, start arms race and things like that. But also, it just gave Europe, Europe was able to, through this, sharing technologies, and was able to advance, not only guns, but like, ships and cannons and armor and steel and things like that. And that was, they just, especially in the beginning of colonization, I mean, they just had superior firepower. I mean, a lot of like the African, Portugal captured a lot of seaports, a lot of coastal towns, African coastal towns, to set up the beginning of the transatlantic slave trades. And I mean, a lot of that was just, they would just bring ships down and just start bombarding, with the cannons, until these cities, kind of just, gave up. And so that, and the same with, a lot of like the, India and China, and a lot of like the South Asia and Southeast Asia, colonization was a lot of just, Europeans showing up with superior firepower, and just, like the Opium Wars, in China, which is essentially, you know, Europe was just, because China, you know, didn't really want anything from Europe, but Europe wanted lots of things from China. So there was this unbalance of trades, but eventually they figured out, they learned if they start trading opium to China, that gave them, you know, made a lot of money for Europe, but China tried to outlaw that. And then Europe came down, you know, Britain, particularly Britain, came down with a bunch of you know, ships and guns, and, you know, basically just forced China to open it back up. And they were able to kind of, you know, not necessarily conquer China, but, you know, dictate the terms of trades, and then, you know, exert a lot of control, colonial control over China because of that. So, you know, just having the superior firepower, you know, did a lot, you know, helped a lot, especially in the beginning, especially with Africa too, as well. You know, the colonization of Africa in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you know, that, you know, millions of Africans resisted and fought, you know, but they could, you know, at that time, you know, Britain had came, you know, invented a machine gun and all different kinds of weapons, and Africa just couldn't resist. You know, millions died trying to. So that was one, but also at the same time, during the slave route, you know, another thing that they were sharing was, diseases, you know, so they're, you know, building up immunities over diseases over, you know, huge portions of populations. So when they did go to, you know, Americas, you know, 95%, you know, 90 to 95% of the indigenous population was wiped out through these diseases. And that, you know, those are millions and millions of people that could have resisted colonization, but instead were completely wiped out, and the people left over just couldn't, you know, resist that. So, you know, Jared Diamond, you know, thesis was, you know, because of these geographies, because of these, you know, east to west trade routes, and he had and a couple other things that he talked about. You know, Europe was able to, you know, get the advantage around, like, you know, weapons and guns and germs and things like that. Another strategy they used was divide and conquer strategy, where they would often pit, you know, different, you know, warring, you know, tribes or nations against each other, to try to weaken them and divide them. And a lot of this, you know, we saw this particularly with Spanish, you know, conquest of the Americas, of Central America and South America. Especially with the conquest of the Aztecs and the conquest of Inca, a lot of this was just really good timing on the Spanish part. I mean, they came in with small, you know, they didn't have a whole lot of numbers at first, but they came in during these, you know, these warring tribes and civil wars, and just, you know, immediately got, you know, allies, you know, like especially with the Aztecs were in Mexico. I like this quote from Wikipedia. It says, 500 Spaniards did not topple the Aztec Empire alone. The empire was a fragile confederation of city-states. Spaniards persuaded the leaders of subordinate city-states and one city-state never conquered by the Aztecs to join them in huge numbers with thousands, perhaps tens of thousands indigenous warriors. And I actually read the Spanish were able to recruit, you know, something like 200,000 warriors, you know, all people were disgruntled people against the Aztec Empire. So they came in at a time when there was already this kind of this huge movement against the Aztec empires, and they just kind of allied themselves, you know, helped, you know, win the war, and then, you know, watched, you know, with a combination of diseases and, you know, and watched, you know, and decimate, you know, watched so many people die from diseases, and eventually, by time, you know, and at the same time, Spain was sending millions of, you know, of its citizens over, and it's just a matter of time before they, you know, there was no one left to resist, you know, the Spanish colonization. And same with Inca, you know, there was this civil war happening in Peru where the Inca Empire was, mainly because the leader of the Inca Empire died from, you know, some of these European diseases, and then the brother, you know, the sons were warring against each other, and then they just came in. Conquistador Pizarro just came in and just allied himself with one of the sides and was able to topple the other side, and eventually, again, you know, eventually with, you know, more colonial Spanish came, came in, as, you know, millions, you know, of them, you know, migrated. At the same time, the diseases were just decimating the population, and you know, at a certain point, when everyone realized that the colonial, you know, Spanish were bad, it was just too late to really put up resistance. So that happened all over, in Africa and different, India and, and different, places where they use, already pre-existing, feuds and against each other to kind of conquer. Um, so another one, another big point was just a European capitalization, industrialization. It's just, because they reached capitalism first, and capitalism was such an efficient system, of creating an enormous amount of wealth from exploitation of land and labor. And because they were, reaching these industrialization at the same time, they were just able to produce an enormous amount of wealth that was reinvested into building technologies and industries and large armies, they developed, not only like, military technologies, but also like steamboat and steam, power, telegraph, railroads, all these different technologies that they were able to achieve through just accumulation of wealth that was reinvested. At the same time, most of the world wasn't still in these like feudalistic societies that weren't as efficient as like just producing and as industrial, so they couldn't, keep up. So they were just overwhelmed by this, the colonial armies and the colonial technology. Same time, capitalist and imperialism, they were backed by these huge monopolies, industrial firms and banking investors, and there's just an enormous amount of wealth that was backing these colonial, invasions as well. So it's just, and the more successful, each invasion was, each colony, the more that was reinvested into creating this, this empire that people couldn't resist. Another thing I want to talk about is unequal trade partnerships, what's called unequal exchange. Walter Rodney wrote this great line about that. He said, the difference between the prices of African exports of raw materials and the importation of manufactured goods constituted a form of unequal exchange. Throughout the colonial period, this inequity as the exchange got worse. And this, we still see this today. This is basically this idea that, if you're creating a product, most of the money that's accrued is from the actual manufacturing of these products. So this was a big, goal of colonial Europe, was to kind of destroy the manufacturing powers of their colonies. And then just create them into these like, countries that just export countries that were just here to export raw materials like cotton and rubber and things like that, and like oil, and then just like, export all that to Europe, and Europe would make these finished products and then sell them back to the same, poor countries at enormous amount of profit. So it's this unequal exchange. In many ways, we still see this today. Most of these products are manufactured in like Europe or China or Japan, and then we have like Latin America and Africa that are just losing, even though they have a lot of the mineral wealth, and resource wealth, but they're their economies are extract economies and export economies, so they don't get as much of that wealth. So it's unequal. A great example of this was the destruction of the Indian textile industry. So, back in, 1700s or so, around there, India built, India had like the best textiles, the best clothes, the best, tapestries and things, and if you wanted, great clothes, India was the best at making that, and so, at first Britain would buy these clothes and textiles and then, trade them, around the world for a small profit, but they really, they wanted to make an enormous amount of profit. So what they did was they essentially destroyed the textile industry in India. And that was, so India, Britain, essentially through military power, defeated the leaders in India, and I want to say like mid 1700s. I think it's like the Battle of Plessy and a couple other battles, and essentially, that India, Britain control, eventually through military conquest, controlled India, or better, that they had this East Indian company that was basically this monopoly company, backed by the British monarch, that controlled India and controlled all the monopolies. But they didn't, but essentially how Britain controlled and colonized India is they only had a small amount of Brits were there, but they set up all these public governments around India that for the most part ran India, normally, but then they had to impose different colonial policies and some of the policies, and they used that, to kind of initiate a bunch of policies to destroy the Indian textile industry. Because the Indian textile industry, a lot of it was like a cottage industry where, India, much like Europe before capitalism, they had the commons, they had tons of common land, and that's where they grew cotton, while on their own land, they grew crops, to sustain themselves, but then grew cotton on the common lands. And then from there, a lot of places, they made these textiles on their own in the cottage industries, and and then would ship them out for a lot of profit. And then they made a lot of money, and it was a great industry. But some of the policies that Britain passed, one, they privatized all the common areas, just like they did in Europe. Then they created, plantation, cotton industries, that just produce, enormous amount of cotton, and they raised the prices so high that the farmers couldn't, peasants or whatever couldn't, buy the cotton anymore. So eventually, if they wanted to continue doing cotton, they had to, grow their own cotton, and through a series of different policies, Britain got India to stop growing mainly food and grow, cotton. But at that point, they didn't have much of an industry left over, so they had to export all that cotton to Britain, where Britain actually stole a lot of the techniques that India used and stole it and brought it back to their factories. They made their own, clothes, and then they sold it back to India. So instead of India being this self-sufficient, economy that not only created food for themselves, but also created, textiles that they were able to sell for a lot of, profit. Instead, through a whole series of policies, Britain, reversed that and got everyone to just basically stop growing food for themselves mainly, and just grow, cotton and cash crops, and then export that instead of actually making products. And there's a whole bunch of things that they did as well. There's a great article by Tara Kashif, Weave in Misery. It talks a lot about all the different policies that Britain did, but essentially by the 1800s, or the India stopped producing textile, finished products, and then just became and reversed it and got everyone into just being, exporters. And the direct results was that created an enormous amount of poverty in India, and eventually created a lot of famines as well. A lot of horrific conditions in India came from this destruction of the textile industry. And at the same time, Europe made an enormous amount of money because they were the ones now making finished products and sending them around the world for. So that was a big part of, how Europe became to really dominate a lot of these industries. So Walter Rodney talked about Europe benefited technologically from its external trade contacts with Africa, either failed to benefit or actually lost. Vital inventions and innovations appeared in England in the late 18th century after profits from external trade had to be reinvested. Indeed, the new machinery represented the investment of primary capital accumulated from trading and from slavery. So this was a big part of scope because, Europe was making, had these unequal trades and was making an enormous amount of money, and was actually imposing laws that was keeping other countries from developing, and actually, undeveloped of some of these countries. And then they would create all these technologies, and then they would not share them, so that's a big point where people talk about, colonization brought, all these technologies and civilizations to the world, and in reality, it prevented a lot of these countries from receiving these technologies, because Europe wanted all their colonies to be these poor colonies that basically, colonies that were forced to extract resources and export them, to European industries, and that happened over centuries. So while Europe was making an enormous amount of money, the rest of the world was just, going in deeper and deeper into poverty. And the last thing I want to talk about is just the anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism. So this justified these horrific systems of colonial systems of brutality, of genocide, of indigenous genocide, of African slavery.
So that, we talked a lot about that already. So, but I mean that, the idea of black, came from the Portugal, setting up their transatlantic slave trade. They're looking for new ways, to enslave people, because the old ways in Western Europe, they would enslave a lot of Eastern Europe tribes, like Slavic people. Like Slav is actually where the word slave comes from. But then they started fortifying and making it harder for them to enslave them. So then they, turned to Africa, and that's where they, Portugal started their first, slave business, trade, system, which became this transatlantic slave system. But at the same time, the Prince Henry, of Portugal, he didn't, he wanted to kind of like, glorify this. So he actually hired this writer, Gomez de Zara, to write, about, glorifying this whole, slave system that they're creating. And so how he glorified it was, he went down and just basically depicted all African people as this, like, savage beast race, this inferior race. They're all the same, and they're all inferior, different species. They're beast-like, and slavery actually brought them civilization. So they were actually bringing them civilization. So it was actually this great thing that Prince Henry was doing, and that that spread. That was a justification for each European country to kind of join in, saying, "Hey, I'm spreading civilization as well." When all of this was mainly just to hide the fact that they were making an enormous amount of money off of like a really horrific exploitation of people. So that spread over Europe, and then spread spread all over the world, but definitely spread over to the colonial America, and then that's really what's created the American slave institutions that continue to finance and provide the majority of the cotton that financed Industrial Revolution came from enslaved hands. So having these anti-black racism really allowed the European countries to just be as brutal and horrific as they wanted to, because it was all done to this inferior class that was actually it was good for them, supposedly. And then again, the anti-Indigenous racism allowed, gave the justifications. A lot of this came from Catholic doctrines, like the doctrine of discovery and other doctrines, who basically classified non-European, non-Christian people as heathens, and that you're actually doing a good thing by conquering them and enslaving them and taking their land. So all these, so having these anti-black and anti-Indigenous racism really allowed for a lot of this colonialism, allowed for the justification, allowed for people to kind of look the other way. It stalled, different abolition movements and things. It stalled all, for centuries. It stalled all this because it permeated in science and religion and philosophy, to the point that people actually bought into this stuff, and no one opposed it for a very, very long time. All right, so the next slide, I want to play this really great video by Kendra Adams, or Kendra Andrews, sorry, about how the West was built on racism. But occasionally, because I do pull all these videos off of typically YouTube for the most part, which is like a public platform, but there are some copyright issues I can normally get around them, because I'm not, trying to buy, make money off of this or anything like that. But occasionally I'll record things, and then when I upload them to YouTube in order to embed them in our sites, I get some copyright issues back. And this is one of them. It was the Guardian news station has a copyright on this. So, which does mean, it just means we can't, I can't, upload it into my presentations, and I can't edit it, which is fine, but we can still play it. You just have to go to the original source. So at this time, if you'd like to see this video, it's only 2 minutes long, but it's a really, really fantastic video. If you want to hit pause in a second on this presentation, just a couple of things. You can either just type out the name, go to YouTube or go to Google and type out the name, and that should take you straight to the YouTube video. Or if you want, if you have the presentations, you can go to cut and paste the YouTube videos, or go to People School, where you're actually watching this, and on the page for Colonialism, Capitalism, there's a link, a hyperlink straight to this video. But if you want to go ahead and just kind of pause this when I'm done talking, and watch this video, and then just come right back to the presentation, hit unpause, and then you should go straight to the next slide. Cool. Thank you all. So a big part, we talked about this a little bit before, but I really like this. Ibram Kendi, wrote a really, great article about how that the origins of these racist ideas, the origins of the anti-Black and anti-Indigenous ideas, the foundation of this was not about spreading hate and ignorance, but it was about the justification of these horrific systems of what of profit, these capitalistic white supremacist patriarchal systems that was creating an enormous amount of wealth for while creating an enormous amount of suffering. So I like that the actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest, particularly economic, political, and cultural. Self-interest derives racist policies that benefit the self-interest. When policies are challenged because they produce inequalities, racist ideas spring up to justify these policies. Hate flows freely from these. For example, the self-interest, Portuguese had to justify their pioneering slave trade of African people before the Pope. And then the racist idea was Africans are barbarians. If we remove them from Africa and enslave them, they would be civilized. And I see this, this happen all throughout colonialism, but it's still happening today. When you look at, the people that are really pushing racist ideas, xenophobic ideas, how we're being invaded by, rapists, drug dealing, immigrants from the South, or terrorists, Muslims, and all these things. They push these ideas, and ultimately they're pushing them so they can get the votes, they can get, to continue being in power, to continue to exploit people in the positions of power. So it's all about power and money. Why they push these stuff. I mean, there are people that do 100% believe in, white people on the top, and they believe that, but the people selling these ideas they know what they're doing. So I'm going to play this. I played this in the first class, so you can skip this if you've already seen this before. But it's Amir Rahman. He's I believe he was a comedian. I'm not quite sure. I wanted to say Australia, but I'm not quite sure exactly where he's from. But he has this really great bit about reverse racism, but I'm not playing this to be to add some comedic relief or anything like that, or to I mean, this isn't a lesson about reverse racism, but he goes through this whole of what it meant to be colonized bit, and I think it's just so important to the understanding of colonization as a whole. So.
A lot of people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Amir. Hey, you get on stage, you make your jokes about white people, you say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. I'm like, well, you do that, Amir. You do that. You get on stage, make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun 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 reverse racism? I said, no, I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out, there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism. And I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China, just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries, so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privilege black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. White people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age, and for their own good because their culture is inferior, and just for kicks. subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. After hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism.